In the next few mini lectures, we'll be covering grafting, the process by which we take two plants and combine them into one. So here's your official definition of grafting. It's the art of joining parts of plants together in such a manner that they will unite and continue to grow as one plant. Now, grafting is a type of asexual propagation. Now, before we can get into detail about grafting, we need to cover a few terms. The first two terms, scion and rootstock, pertain to the different parts of the grafted plant. So the scion is the upper portion or top of a grafted plant, as you can see in the picture. Now, the scion can be a larger piece of a plant, so a stem with several nodes, as shown in the picture here, or it can just be a single bud. It depends on the type of graft you're doing. So the scion is the upper portion of the plant, and the rootstock is the lower portion or the root-bearing portion of the grafted plant. Now, all grafted plants have a scion or a rootstock, but not all of them have that third term, interstock. An interstock is an intermediate stem or bud piece grafted between a scion and a rootstock. So sometimes you just have a scion and a rootstock. Sometimes you will have a scion, interstock, and rootstock. If you use an interstock, that type of grafting is called double working. A few more terms for you here. The graft union is just the juncture at which the scion and the stock, and let me interject here, the stock and the rootstock are the same thing. A lot of times in the trade, people just refer to rootstocks as the stock. So the graft union is the juncture at which the scion and the stock of a grafted plant have successfully united. You can see it shown in the picture here where the two different plants very clearly are connected together at the graft union. The next term, incompatibility, is the inability of a grafted scion and stock to produce a successful graft union or to have the resulting grafted plant develop satisfactorily. So what you want is a successful graft union to form where the scion and the stock successfully combine into one plant, but if they don't, that's known as incompatibility. Now, incompatibility can be an immediate thing. It happens at the time that you make the graft, and so the graft just doesn't take. It can also occur later. Sometimes the graft union will initially form successfully, but then over time the incompatibility of the two species overcomes that union, and so you may have incompatibility showing up a few years after your graft as well. Here are just two more pictures of graft unions. These are both successful graft unions, even though one of them is obviously a much smoother looking graft union than the other. So here on the left, the graft union is such that you can hardly even see it, but I'm tracing it here with this line. The picture on the right, this is still a successful graft union. Both parts, the rootstock and the scion, are alive, so it's not incompatibility. The reason why the two pieces look so drastically different here is just that these are two plants that, while compatible with each other, are genetically predisposed to have different color bark, different ultimate diameter, and so that's why it looks a little bit weird. But as long as both the rootstock and the scion are alive, then you know that they are compatible and the graft union is formed the way it should. One last term for you here, the vascular cambium. The vascular cambium is a thin meristematic tissue of the plant located between the bark, or phloem, and the wood, or xylem. We touched on this briefly way back at the beginning of the semester in plant anatomy. But the vascular cambium is a type of meristem. It's causing the plant to grow larger in girth. It's producing new xylem and phloem. And that last part is the really important part for grafting. In order for your scion and rootstock to successfully combine together and form a good graft union, a new vascular cambium has to form, bridging the gap between the rootstock and the scion. And once that new vascular cambium forms, it then produces new xylem and phloem that connect the scion and the stock such that resources like water and nutrients and sugars can freely move back and forth between the stock and the scion. When we do a graft, we have to make sure that the vascular cambium of the rootstock is in close contact with the vascular cambium of the scion in order for us to have a successful graft union. And I forgot, we do have one last term here. Callus is a term applied to the mass of parenchyma cells that develop from and around wounded plant tissue. And we've had this term before too. We've discussed callus in regard to the formation of adventitious roots. Callus also occurs at the junction of a graft union. So before the new vascular cambium and the new xylem and phloem can form, bridging the gap between the stalk and the scion, what you first get is callus, because remember, those parenchyma cells are very undifferentiated, and that means they make good building blocks for whatever new tissue you need made, whether that's adventitious roots on a cutting or new vascular cambia in a graft union. So in the picture here, you can see that sort of whitish, fuzzy looking stuff growing around where this bud has been inserted. This is a type of grafting called budding, where the scion is a single bud inserted into the rootstock, and there's a lot of callus forming all around that graft union, which will hopefully give rise to new vascular cambium in a successful graft union. So, before I close this first part of our series on grafting, I want to talk about the cost of grafted plants. Grafting is a technique of propagation that takes a lot of skill and practice. You'll remember at the beginning of the semester we talked about how plant propagation is both an art and a science, and by art we mean technical skills that you have to acquire. There's a lot of art to grafting. There's a lot of technical skills that you really have to do a lot of times before you get good at it, and it's a lot of hand labor, so that makes this the most expensive form of propagation. You will notice that if you look at many nurseries, a good example, if you'll Google Tar Heel native trees and look at the prices of some of their plants, you'll notice some things like Japanese maples and dwarf gymnosperms, such as this miniature pine shown here. They tend to be really expensive. You'll find like a 3 or a 5 gallon plant, which isn't that large, for something like $50 to $100. And you're thinking, why is this teeny tiny pine tree so expensive? It's because it was grafted. Almost all Japanese maples that are for sale commercially are grafted, and the same with dwarf gymnosperms. Those aren't the only grafted plants, but they're two good examples. And so, because there's so much skill and labor involved, a grafted plant is always going to be more expensive than something that was just propagated by cuttings. So with that, we'll end. In the next few mini lectures, we'll go in a little more detail about the techniques and purposes of grafting.